Imagine you're 58 years old. You've lived your entire life in Poland, in the same small town outside Krakow where you were born, where you raised your children, where you buried your husband. And then, one ordinary autumn morning, you pack 2 suitcases, say goodbye to everyone who has ever known you, and fly across an ocean to marry a man 22 years younger than you, in a country where you barely speak the language. My own son called me on the phone and said, "Mama, have you completely lost your mind? You're embarrassing this family." And today, David and I have been married for almost 5 years. Even my son flew here last spring, sat in our kitchen and told me he finally understood. Hi, my name is Krystyna. I'm 63 years old, and I've been living in the United States for almost 5 years now, in a small town in Ohio I'd never once heard of before I met the man who would eventually become my husband. I was born and lived my entire life in Poland, in a town called Wieliczka, not far from Krakow, famous mostly for its old salt mines. I married my first husband, Tomasz, when I was 21. We had 2 children together, my daughter Agnieszka and my son Peter. I worked for over 30 years as a bookkeeper for a small textile company, the kind of steady, unremarkable job that let me raise my family without ever having to worry too much about money. Life was predictable in the best possible way. Sunday dinners with the whole family crowded around one table. Summer trips to my sister's cottage by the lake. Everything a person could reasonably want. Then, 9 years ago, my Tomasz passed away. A heart attack, sudden, with almost no warning at all. One evening he complained of feeling tired. By morning he was gone. After his death, our apartment became unbearably quiet. My children came when they could, called often, helped however they were able to, but they had their own lives by then. Agnieszka was married with 3 children of her own. Peter had moved to Warsaw for work and had a demanding job that kept him travelling most weeks. I was left alone in an apartment that had once been full of noise and had become, almost overnight, full of silence instead. I was only 54 when Tomasz died, but some mornings I felt considerably older than that. I stopped going out as much. I watched more television than I care to admit. I found myself crying quietly more evenings than not, sitting alone at the same kitchen table where our whole family used to gather. One cold evening, almost 2 years after Tomasz passed, I was scrolling through my phone, unable to sleep, and I came across a video, almost by accident, about older women who had found new relationships later in life. Some of them through online communities for widows and widowers looking to connect with others who understood exactly what that particular kind of loneliness felt like. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt something I hadn't expected. Curiosity, a small tentative spark of hope. I started spending my evenings reading through one of these communities, mostly just observing at first, watching other people share their stories, their photographs, their small updates about rebuilding lives that grief had quietly hollowed out. After a few months, almost without deciding to, I created a simple profile myself, describing who I was, what my life had looked like, what I still hoped it might become. I met David about 4 months after joining that community. He was 51, widowed himself for almost 3 years, living in a small town in Ohio, working as a high school history teacher. His profile picture showed him standing in front of an old brick schoolhouse, smiling in a way that seemed, even in a photograph, genuinely warm. We started messaging, cautiously at first, mostly about ordinary things. Our children, our late spouses. The strange, disorienting experience of learning to be a single person again, after decades of being part of a couple. David's English was, of course, effortless, but he was surprisingly patient with my own English, which was serviceable but far from fluent at the time, never once making me feel embarrassed for the mistakes I made or the words I had to look up mid-conversation. We video called for the first time about 6 weeks after we started messaging, and I remember being nervous in a way I hadn't felt in decades, adjusting my hair 3 times before finally answering the call. We talked for almost 3 hours that first evening about everything and nothing, and by the time we said goodnight, I understood with a clarity that surprised me that something meaningful had already begun. We continued like that for nearly a year, video calls most evenings, long messages exchanged throughout our days, slowly building a closeness that felt, despite the distance and the age difference, remarkably solid. David flew to Poland to meet me in person 8 months after we first started talking, staying for 2 weeks in a small hotel near my apartment, and by the end of that visit, we both understood, without needing to say it directly, exactly what we wanted next. The age difference between us was 22 years. I want to be honest that it wasn't something either of us ignored or pretended didn't matter. We talked about it directly more than once, both of us aware of how it might look to people who didn't understand the particular kind of connection we'd built. When I told my children I was planning to move to America to marry David, the reaction was, in a word, explosive. Agnieszka called me crying within an hour of hearing the news. Mama, you're 62 years old. You've never even left Poland for more than 2 weeks at a time. How can you just move across the world for a man you barely know? I know him better than you think, I told her. We've talked almost every single day for over a year. That's not the same as actually living with someone, Mama. What if this is a mistake? What if he's not who he says he is? Peter was harder still. He didn't call crying. He called angry, his voice sharp in a way I'd rarely heard from my usually gentle son. Mama, have you completely lost your mind? You're embarrassing this family. What will people think, you running off to marry a man young enough to be your... He stopped himself before finishing that sentence, but I understood exactly what he'd meant to say. He is not young enough to be my son, Peter, I said quietly. He is 51 years old. A grown man with his own grief, his own history, his own children who are older than some of your own friends. That doesn't matter. Everyone will judge you. Everyone will judge us. I understood underneath their anger that they were afraid for me, the same fear any child feels watching a parent make a choice that seems, from the outside, difficult to fully understand. But inside me, a small flame had already been burning for months, and I found, to my own surprise, that I couldn't put it out simply because my children disapproved. So 6 months later, I sold most of what I owned, packed 2 suitcases, and flew to Ohio with a one-way ticket. The first months in America were harder than I had allowed myself to imagine. I had to relearn everything. How grocery stores worked differently than the small markets I'd shopped at my whole life. How to navigate a driver's license exam in a language that still occasionally tangled itself in my mouth when I was nervous. How to understand the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people speaking a language I understood well enough to follow, but not well enough to fully belong inside. There were evenings, sitting alone in David's house while he taught late classes, when I asked myself, quietly in Polish, what exactly I had done. But every morning, waking up beside a man who made me coffee exactly the way I liked it, who asked genuinely about my day, who never once made me feel foolish for the choice I'd made, I felt something in me slowly, steadily, coming back to life. We married 8 months after I arrived, a small ceremony at the local courthouse, followed by dinner with a handful of David's closest friends. None of my own family attended, not out of malice, but simply because neither Agnieszka nor Peter had been ready at that point to fully accept what I'd done. The following 2 years tested us in ways neither of us had fully anticipated. The cultural differences were real, and sometimes exhausting. I was used to a certain formality, a certain reserve that American directness occasionally rubbed against uncomfortably. David's easy, casual friendliness with strangers sometimes struck me as strange, even suspicious, in ways I had to slowly, deliberately unlearn. There was also the matter of money. My pension from Poland, combined with David's teacher's salary, was enough for a comfortable, modest life, but not the kind of life either of us had lived before, separately in our previous marriages. I remember one particularly difficult winter, our heating bill higher than expected, both of us quietly worried about how we'd manage, neither of us saying much about it directly, both of us simply working a little harder, saving a little more carefully, learning what it actually meant to build something together from a more modest foundation than either of us had started with before. The hardest moment came when I was 61. A sudden, severe bout of pneumonia landed me in the hospital for 9 days, my fever spiking dangerously on the 3rd night, David staying by my bedside almost the entire time, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, holding my hand through the worst of it. I remember in my most feverish moments genuinely believing I might not survive it, and thinking with a clarity that frightened me that my children would say I'd brought this on myself, moving across the world at my age for a man so much younger than me. David never left that hospital room for more than an hour at a time during those 9 days. When my fever finally broke, he cried quietly, holding my hand, and told me, "I don't know what I would have done, Krystyna, I need you here. Please don't ever scare me like that again." In that moment I understood something I hadn't fully let myself believe before, despite everything we'd already built together. This wasn't some fleeting, foolish infatuation, the kind my children feared it might be. This was real, steady, patient love, tested now by illness and hardship in exactly the way any long marriage eventually gets tested. After that hospital stay, something shifted between David and me, a deepening that felt in its own way like a genuine second beginning. We started taking better care of ourselves, walking together every morning before David left for school, cooking more carefully, slowing down in ways neither of us had quite managed during those first, harder years of building a life together. And then, almost 2 years after my hospital stay, Agnieszka finally came to visit. She arrived with a guarded, careful expression, clearly still uncertain of what she'd find, still half expecting, I think, to discover some version of the mistake she'd been warning me about for years. For the first 2 days she was polite but distant with David, watching him carefully, saying little. On the third day we took her to a small lake near our house, the kind of quiet, unremarkable place David and I had come to love over our years together. She watched him carry the picnic basket, watched him fuss gently over whether I'd remembered my hat against the sun, watched the easy, comfortable rhythm we'd built together over 5 years of marriage. That evening, sitting on our back porch, Agnieszka took my hand, tears in her eyes for the first time since she'd arrived. "Mama," she said quietly, "I thought you'd made the biggest mistake of your life. But you're happy here, genuinely happy. I haven't seen you like this since before Papa died." Week later, she was hugging David goodbye at the airport, calling him, half joking, her American brother. Peter came the following spring, more reserved than his sister had been. But by the end of his own visit, he too had softened considerably. Watching David patiently help him fix a flat tire on my old bicycle. Watching the two of us move through an ordinary Sunday morning with the kind of easy comfort that no longer looked, to Peter's eyes, anything like the disaster he'd once feared. It's been almost 5 years now since I first arrived in Ohio with 2 suitcases and a heart full of uncertain hope. David is 56 now. I'm 63. The age difference that once seemed to my children and to half our small town like an obvious sign of some terrible mistake has simply become, over the years, an unremarkable fact about our marriage, no more significant than any other ordinary detail of a life built carefully together. I don't know how many years David and I will have together. Perhaps 5 more. Perhaps 20. Nobody at any age in any marriage ever really knows the answer to that question. But every morning when I wake up beside him, when I smell coffee brewing exactly the way I like it, when I remember how frightened and uncertain I felt boarding that plane 5 years ago, I feel something close to genuine gratitude that I found the courage to be, as my son once called it, a little bit crazy. If you are over 50, over 60, if some part of you has quietly convinced yourself that meaningful new beginnings belong only to the young, I hope my story reminds you of something important. It is never too late to choose a different life. It is never too late to let yourself hope again. Even if everyone around you insists you've lost your mind, sometimes that particular kind of madness turns out to be the wisest choice you'll ever make. Thank you for being with me through this story. If it touched you in any way, please share your own story in the comments below. I read every single one and I think of each of you. As long as your heart is still beating, your life is not finished being written. The end.